The Grovewood Inn stood glowing against the evening sky, its tall windows spilling golden light onto the stone terrace. I straightened my dress, simple navy cotton with a pearl brooch at the collar, and clutched the silver-wrapped box in my hands. 10 years of marriage was a milestone, and I thought showing up to celebrate Preston and Clarissa would be a gesture of goodwill, a step toward mending the silences that had crept into our family. Inside, the air smelled of roasted lamb and polished wood. Guests in tailored suits and glittering dresses mingled near the bar, their laughter rising above the quiet music of a string quartet. I walked toward the hostess stand, rehearsing the smile I would give my son when he turned and saw me there. "Good evening, ma'am," the hostess said, eyes bright but distracted as she tapped on her tablet. "Name, please Marjorie Ellison," I replied, shifting the gift from one hand to the other. "I'm here for the Ellison anniversary dinner." Her brows knitted together as she scrolled. "I'm sorry, I don't see your name listed. That must be a mistake," I said gently. "I'm Preston's mother." Before she could answer, Preston appeared from the dining room. His charcoal jacket fit him like a second skin, his tie knotted perfectly. He froze when he saw me. Then his lips curved not into a smile, but into something cold. "Mom," he said, voice low but sharp, "you weren't invited." He glanced over his shoulder, where Clarissa and her friends were watching. "Please leave before this gets awkward." A staff member in a black suit shifted closer. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I held the gift tighter, nodded once, and turned toward the door. The night air hit my face, cool and sharp, as I walked back to my car. My steps measured, though my chest burned, carrying me into the memory of every sacrifice I had made. Driving home from the Grovewood Inn, I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind slipped back to the years when every mile of my life had been paved with sacrifice. After Robert passed from a sudden heart attack, the world became smaller, heavier. Preston was only 12. I promised him that his father's absence wouldn't mean the end of his chances. So I took the late shift at Mission Hospital's cafeteria, ladling soup until midnight, then woke up at dawn to scrub cabins for tourists in the Blue Ridge. I remember the sting in my back, the cracked skin on my hands, the silence of evenings when friends invited me out and I had to decline because the bills stacked higher than the invitations. Preston was my reason. When he brought home his acceptance letter from UNC Chapel Hill, I cried in the kitchen, holding that envelope like a lifeline. He had no idea the relief it gave me, the confirmation that every hour I spent exhausted and hungry was worth it. I sent him off to campus with secondhand furniture loaded in a borrowed truck, smiling as if I hadn't sold my wedding band to cover the deposit. Years later, when he wanted his first condo in Charlotte, I signed away a piece of my own security. I refinanced our modest house in Biltmore Village, the home Robert and I had built together, and told myself it was an investment in Preston's independence. My friends traveled to Italy, joined book clubs, retired into leisure. I stayed home, clipping coupons, telling myself that every sacrifice was a seed planted in my son's future. The day he crossed the graduation stage in his cap and gown, I stood in the crowd with my heart swelling. That moment, I thought, was the return on every sacrifice. Now, standing in my kitchen years later, with his gift still unopened in my hands, I wondered how the boy I had raised through loss and labor could become the man who turned me away. It hadn't always been this way with Preston. For years after college, he would call me on Sundays, sometimes just to hear my voice. He would stop by unannounced, raid my pantry for his favorite blueberry preserves, and tease me about the way I still folded his laundry even when he was grown. But when Clarissa entered his life, the warmth shifted. She was polished, sharp, and beautiful, in the way that photographs in glossy magazines are beautiful, impressive from a distance, impossible up close. At first, I tried to welcome her. I took her to the farmer's market on Charlotte Street, hoping we might find common ground over fresh peaches and honey jars. Instead, she smiled politely and later told Preston that my life seemed small. Over the years, her remarks grew bolder. At holiday dinners, she would place me at the end of the table, saying it was better for the older crowd. When conversation turned to homes and vacations, she would glance at me with a smile too sweet and remark, "Well, Marjorie's house is cozy." Each word was a needle dressed in silk. I saw the change in Preston. The man who once defended my choices began to echo her words. He would correct the way I held a wine glass, remind me not to say too much at gatherings, and assure me that appearances mattered more than comfort. It wasn't long before my presence at their events felt like an obligation, rather than a welcome. The Grovewood Inn dinner wasn't simply an anniversary. It was Clarissa's showcase, a carefully curated image of a perfect marriage, perfect family, perfect success. I had become the imperfection she could not allow on display. Driving past the darkened streets of Asheville that night, I realized it wasn't just my son's voice that had cut me down. It was hers, whispered into his ear until he believed it was his own. And that realization burned deeper than the words he had spoken at the door, carrying me into the silence of my home where the unopened gift still sat waiting. I should have turned away the moment Preston told me to leave, but the box in my hands kept me rooted. Inside was more than a gift. It was the story of a life. Over weeks, I had pieced together the album, photographs of him with Robert in the backyard, fishing trips on the French Broad River, snapshots of birthdays and scraped knees and first days of school. I thought it would remind him of where he came from, of who held him through the storms. So I stepped forward, ignoring the hostess's uncertain glance. "I brought you something," I said, my voice softer than I intended. I held the box toward him. Clarissa's eyes flicked down at it, then back up with a smile that wasn't a smile at all. "Just leave it with the staff. Marjorie," she said lightly, as though brushing lint from a sleeve. "We'll collect it later." I looked at Preston. For a moment I thought he might soften, that the boy who once pressed daisies into my hands would look at me again. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably and muttered, "This is embarrassing. Mom, people are staring?" And they were. Heads had turned. Conversations had stilled. I saw polite guests pretending to sip their champagne, their eyes darting between us. My cheeks burned hot. The box grew heavier in my hands, though it weighed almost nothing. I lowered it slowly, pressing it back to my chest. "Of course," I whispered. My words fell flat on the marble floor. Unheard, unwanted. Clarissa had already turned away, her laughter rising unnaturally bright as she touched a guest's arm. Preston lingered only a moment longer before following her back into the glow of the dining room, leaving me at the threshold. Invisible, I tightened my grip on the gift, squared my shoulders, and walked toward the exit. The cool mountain night air rushed against my face, sharp and sobering, as I stepped into the dark parking lot. Each measured step carried me farther from their world and closer to the quiet resolve waiting inside my own home. The drive home wound along the familiar bends of the French Broad River, the headlights sweeping across water that shimmered in the dark. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the weight of the evening pressed heavier than the gift still resting on the passenger seat. I carried it inside, set it carefully on the kitchen table, and stood in the silence of my small bungalow. The quiet was almost too much to bear. I opened a bottle of Merlot, poured a glass, and let the first sip steady me. The sting of humiliation still pulsed in my chest, but beneath it ran something colder, sharper, a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I moved to the closet where Robert's old safe box sat tucked behind blankets. My hands trembled as I lifted it onto the table and spun the dial. Inside lay the estate files I had protected since Robert's death bonds. Property deeds, account summaries, nearly $2 million in accumulated fortune. The foundation of the life we had built together for years. I had told myself it would pass to Preston when I was gone. It was the natural order. A father's gift preserved by a mother's devotion. I spread the papers across the table, the numbers staring back at me like an accusation. My son had cast me aside in front of strangers, embarrassed to claim me as his own. And yet, here I was, ready to hand him everything Robert and I had worked for. I pulled out a blank legal pad, began drafting changes. The lines came easily, the estate to be redirected, beneficiaries adjusted, safeguards in place. Each word steadied my breath, but when I reached for the pen to sign, I stopped. Some small, stubborn corner of my heart hesitated. I set the pen down, leaned back in my chair, and stared at the album still lying unopened beside me. I would not finalize it tonight. If Preston came, if he knocked on my door, looked me in the eye, and remembered who I was, perhaps there might still be a bridge left standing. I left the papers scattered on the table, turned off the kitchen light, and walked down the hall, waiting for what silence or morning might bring. The morning light crept through the blinds, soft and indifferent. I lingered in bed longer than usual, the events of the night before replaying in fragments, the way Preston's voice cut, the way Clarissa's smile sharpened, the way every pair of eyes had followed me as if I were a trespasser. My chest felt raw, but the tears had dried sometime in the night. What remained was something quieter, steadier. When I finally reached for my phone, the screen lit up with a flood of notifications. 36 missed calls, 17 voicemails, 42 text messages. For a moment, I just stared at the numbers. I pressed play on the first voicemail. Preston's voice, taut with rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing? The venue says the payment bounced. Fix this now." The next one was harsher still. His words slurred with what I guessed was leftover champagne. "You've embarrassed us in front of everyone. Do you know how this makes us look?" By midnight, the tone had changed. "Mom, please. We need you." His voice cracked. "Don't let this ruin everything." Clarissa's texts came in waves, first accusing, then demanding. "You've humiliated us. This is your fault. Make this right." Then softer. "We can work this out, but you need to fix it immediately." I scrolled past them all, my thumbs steady. The mortgage company had called too, their message polite but firm. A payment had been withdrawn, and they needed clarification. A second voicemail came from the credit card company. The dinner charges had maxed out their line. I set the phone face down on the counter and poured myself coffee. The kitchen filled with its rich, familiar aroma, grounding me in something that belonged only to me. Their panic spilled through every message, but none of it touched the calm that had settled inside me. For the first time in years, I wasn't scrambling to protect them. The phone buzzed again against the table, but I didn't move. I simply lifted my cup, took a slow sip, and waited for the day to unfold, knowing the storm would soon arrive at my door. The house was quiet, the only sound the steady tick of the clock above the mantel. I had drifted into half-sleep when the pounding began. Sharp, insistent, rattling the glass panes of the front door. I slipped on my robe, my stomach heavy with the knowledge of who it must be. When I opened the door, Preston stood there in the porch light. His tie was gone, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. He looked nothing like the man who had dismissed me hours before. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking, Please, you've got to fix this. The house. It's leveraged to the roof. The mortgage company's calling, and my job's hanging by a thread. I can't keep it together. Before I could answer, Clarissa pushed past him into the hallway. Her heels clicked sharply against the wood floor, her perfume too strong, her composure cracking. This is ridiculous, she snapped. You owe us. After everything we've built, after everything we've given this family name, you can't just walk away. We are family. Marjorie, you can't do this to us. Her words cut through the silence, but I didn't flinch. I looked at Preston, at the boy I once carried on my hip through Asheville's farmers markets, now standing hollow-eyed, built on debts and bravado. It wasn't a mistake, I said, my voice calm and even. It was a choice. Clarissa's eyes widened, her mouth falling open in disbelief. Preston's shoulders slumped as though the weight of his entire life had finally pressed down on him. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air between us was heavy with everything that had been given, taken, and now withdrawn. I stepped back toward the doorway, waiting, as their silence stretched into the night and the cracks in their perfect world began to show. Clarissa's heels clicked furiously as she paced my hallway, her voice rising sharper with every word. You think this is about money? It's about appearances. Marjorie, you don't understand how people look at us. Your old-fashioned ways. Your modest little house. Your plain clothes. They don't belong in the circles we move in now. That's why I told Preston you couldn't be there. You ruined the image we've built. Her confession hung in the air, bitter and unrepentant. I turned my gaze to Preston. He shifted, his face pale, his jaw tight. Clarissa. Stop, he muttered, but she pressed on. She doesn't fit. Preston. And you know it. That's why we enough. He burst out, his voice cracking. He dragged his hands through his hair, then looked at me with hollow eyes. She's been paying for everything. Clarissa, the mortgage, the dinner. Half the damn life we live, it's her. Not us. Without her, we have nothing. The words dropped like stones into the room. Clarissa froze, her mouth parted in shock. She spun toward him, her perfect composure fracturing. What are you talking about? Preston couldn't hold her gaze. 3 years. She's been carrying us. And I let you believe it was me. I let everyone believe it was me. Clarissa's expression curdled, outrage and panic colliding. For the first time, her voice faltered. You mean to tell me, all this time, we've been living on her money? Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The mask of superiority they had both worn cracked wide open, revealing nothing beneath but fear. I stood there, steady as stone, while the world they had built on lies began to tremble around them, knowing the choice ahead would change everything. By morning, I had no more hesitation left in me. The house was still, but my mind was clear, steadier than it had been in years. I gathered the estate documents, tucked them into my bag, and drove into downtown Asheville. The streets were waking cafes opening, the courthouse bell striking 9 as I climbed the narrow stairs to my lawyer's office. Mr. Donnelly greeted me with his usual calm professionalism. He had managed Robert's estate since the beginning, and he looked at me now with quiet understanding, as though he already knew why I had come. I laid the papers on his desk. I want to change the will, I said simply. Not a cent goes to Preston. Not anymore. His brows rose slightly, but he nodded, and instead, to a foundation, I said. Scholarships for single mothers at UNC Asheville. Women who need a hand to keep their children's dreams alive. My voice steadied as I spoke the words, the shape of my decision falling into place like it had been waiting all along. He smiled faintly, pulled the forms toward him, and began the necessary revisions. When he finished, he tapped the last page and slid it across to me. A legacy of dignity, he said. I signed my name with deliberate care, each stroke final, unshakable. The pen felt heavy, then light, as though something had been released. When I stepped back outside, the sun broke through the clouds, warming the cold stone of the street. I breathed deeply, the weight that had bent my shoulders for years lifting as I walked toward my car. Free at last to choose the future on my own terms, ready to return home to the quiet that finally belonged to me. Weeks slipped by, each one quieter than the last. I heard from neighbors and church friends that Preston and Clarissa had put their house in Biltmore Forest on the market. The grand facade that once made them glow with pride now stood for sale, its manicured lawn a silent witness to their unraveling. Asheville society, always eager for a story, whispered about the couple who had turned away, the mother holding their fortune. I didn't correct a single word. At home, my days returned to a gentler rhythm. I rose early, brewed my coffee, and walked the garden beds with Sylvia. She brought cuttings of her favorite roses, and I planted dogwoods along the back fence, their roots settling into the soil that would outlast me. We spoke about ordinary things, recipes, books, memories, while our hands worked the dirt. For the first time in years, the air around me felt light. One afternoon, I rested on the porch with the photo album still wrapped on the table beside me. I didn't need to open it. The memories were alive in me. Robert's laugh, Preston's small hand clutching mine, the sound of our old screen door slamming shut on summer nights. Those belonged to me, not to the version of him that had turned me away. I thought about inheritance, how I had once believed it was measured in dollars and deeds. Now I saw it differently. True inheritance was in the lessons we leave behind, the grit to stand firm, the wisdom to walk away, the courage to choose dignity over approval. As the evening light stretched across the garden, I pressed my hands into the earth beside the new dogwoods, knowing they would bloom long after I was gone.